Elena Martinez had always dreamed of a perfect wedding, but standing in the grand ballroom of the Blackwood mansion, she felt like a stranger in her own life. The elaborate white gown that cost more than her family's annual income hung heavy on her shoulders. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, and hundreds of guests whispered behind silk fans about the unusual match between the wealthy Blackwood heir and a simple baker's daughter. Alexander Blackwood stood at the altar, his dark eyes scanning the crowd but never settling on her. His jaw was set in a hard line, and Elena could see the tension in his broad shoulders beneath the expensive black tuxedo. She had met him only 3 times before this day, each meeting arranged by their families. He spoke to her with polite disinterest, as if she were a business transaction rather than his future wife. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical precision. Elena's hands trembled as she held the bouquet of white roses, their thorns pricking her fingers through the delicate lace gloves. When the priest asked if Alexander would take Elena as his wife, there was a pause that seemed to stretch for eternity. The silence filled the vast room like thick fog, and Elena felt every pair of eyes boring into her. "I do," Alexander finally said, his voice flat and emotionless. Elena's own vows caught in her throat. She looked into Alexander's eyes, searching for any spark of warmth, any sign that this marriage could become something real. Instead, she found only cold duty. Her voice barely above a whisper, she managed to speak the words that would bind her to a man who clearly wished he were anywhere else. The reception that followed felt like a beautiful nightmare. Elena sat at the head table watching guests celebrate a union that felt hollow. Alexander barely spoke to her, instead engaging in business discussions with his father's associates. She picked at the expensive meal, her appetite lost among the forced smiles and congratulations from people who barely knew her. Margaret Blackwood, Alexander's mother, approached Elena during the dancing. Her smile was sharp as a blade, and her diamond necklace caught the light like ice. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I do hope you understand what's expected of you now." Elena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what those expectations were. She had grown up helping her parents run their small bakery, kneading dough before dawn and serving customers with genuine warmth. This world of elaborate rules and hidden meanings felt alien to her. As the evening wore on, Elena noticed strange things about the Blackwood family and their closest friends. They seemed unusually pale, their movements too graceful, too fluid. When they laughed, she caught glimpses of teeth that seemed sharper than normal. The older guests avoided the windows, staying in the shadowed corners of the ballroom even though the summer evening was beautiful. During the bouquet toss, Elena's younger sister Sophia caught the flowers. The joy on Sophia's face made Elena's heart ache. Sophia still believed in fairy tale endings, still thought love conquered all. Elena envied that innocence, remembering when she too had dreamed of marrying for love rather than family obligation. The Blackwood family had approached Elena's parents 6 months ago with an offer they couldn't refuse. Her father's bakery was failing, drowning in debt after her mother's expensive cancer treatments. The medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, and bankruptcy loomed over their family like a storm cloud. Alexander's father, Victor Blackwood, had offered to pay all their debts and set up a trust fund for Sophia's college education in exchange for Elena's hand in marriage. At first, Elena had refused. She dreamed of going to culinary school, maybe opening her own restaurant someday. She had been dating Carlos, a kind boy from her neighborhood who made her laugh and brought her wildflowers. But when her mother took a turn for the worse and needed an experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, Elena knew what she had to do. Breaking up with Carlos had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done. He had begged her not to marry Alexander, offering to work 3 jobs if necessary to help her family. But Elena knew his modest income as a construction worker could never cover hundreds of thousands in medical debt. She kissed him goodbye on a rainy Tuesday evening, tasting salt from both their tears. Now, as midnight approached, Elena found herself alone in her new bedroom in the east wing of the Blackwood mansion. The room was beautiful but cold, decorated in shades of cream and gold that felt more like a museum display than a home. Her wedding dress hung in the massive closet like a ghost of broken dreams. Alexander had barely spoken to her since they'd cut the cake. He had retreated to his study, claiming urgent business matters that couldn't wait. Elena suspected he simply couldn't bear to be near her any longer than necessary. She had heard the servants whispering about how he had fought against the marriage arrangement, how he'd threatened to leave the family business rather than go through with it. Elena sat at the antique dressing table, removing the pearl pins from her elaborate hairstyle. In the mirror, she looked like a stranger to herself. The professional makeup made her appear older, more sophisticated, but her eyes still held the uncertainty of a 22-year-old girl who had no idea what she'd gotten herself into. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Maria, the kind housekeeper who had helped her dress for the wedding. Instead, Alexander stepped into the room. He had removed his jacket and tie, and his white shirt was partially unbuttoned, revealing a glimpse of pale chest. His dark hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his usually perfect composure seemed fractured. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Elena turned to face him, her heart racing. In the dim lamplight, his features looked sharper, more dangerous. There was something predatory in the way he moved, something that made her instinctively step back even though she was sitting down. "About what?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. Alexander closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "About what kind of marriage this is going to be." His eyes, which she had always thought were dark brown, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. "You need to understand that this is purely a business arrangement. Don't expect romance, don't expect affection, and certainly don't expect love." Elena's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. "I never asked for love from you," she replied, standing up to face him. Even in her bare feet, she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. "I know exactly why I'm here, and it has nothing to do with fairy tales." Something flickered across Alexander's face, an emotion too quick to identify. "Good," he said after a moment. "Then we understand each other." But as he turned to leave, Elena found herself speaking again. "What I don't understand is why you agreed to this if you hate it so much. Your family is wealthy enough that they don't need a political alliance with my father's bakery." Alexander paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a long moment, Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "There are things about my family that you don't understand, Elena. Things that require certain sacrifices." He looked back at her over his shoulder, and in that moment she could have sworn his eyes flashed red in the lamplight. "This marriage protects you as much as it serves our purposes." Before Elena could ask what he meant, Alexander was gone, leaving her alone with more questions than answers. She sank back onto the bed, her wedding dress spread around her like spilled milk. Outside her window, she could hear the last of the wedding guests departing, their laughter fading into the night. Elena walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling gardens of the Blackwood estate. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light. In the distance, she could see Alexander walking along one of the garden paths, his movements too quick and fluid for a normal person. As she watched, he seemed to disappear into the shadows between one step and the next, as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. A chill ran down Elena's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She thought about the strange guests at the wedding, the way Alexander's family avoided sunlight, the unnatural grace in their movements. Stories her grandmother used to tell her came flooding back, tales of creatures that walked the night and fed on more than ordinary food. Elena shook her head, trying to dispel such ridiculous thoughts. She was letting her imagination run wild because of stress and exhaustion. There had to be a rational explanation for everything she had noticed. Rich people were eccentric, that was all. They could afford to be different, to have unusual habits and preferences. But as she prepared for bed, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Blackwood family's wealth came from somewhere, and their influence extended far beyond what a normal business could achieve. There were too many coincidences, too many strange details that didn't add up. As Elena finally drifted off to sleep in her new bedroom, she dreamed of red eyes in the darkness and the sound of footsteps that made no noise. In her dreams, Alexander stood at the foot of her bed, watching her with an hunger that had nothing to do with normal human desires. When she tried to run, she found herself moving through thick honey, unable to escape the predator that stalked her through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. She woke just before dawn, her nightgown soaked with sweat and her heart pounding. The room was empty, but she could have sworn she smelled something metallic in the air, something that reminded her of copper pennies and fear. Elena got up and checked the door, finding it locked from the inside just as she had left it. But on her nightstand, there was a single red rose that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. Its petals were so dark they were almost black, and when Elena picked it up, she pricked her finger on a thorn. The drop of blood that welled up seemed to gleam unnaturally bright in the morning light. Elena realized that her new life was going to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. As she looked out at the sunrise painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she made a silent promise to herself. She would figure out the truth about the Blackwood family no matter how dangerous that truth might be. The marriage was supposed to last only long enough to fulfill the contract and secure her family's financial future. But Elena was beginning to suspect that leaving the Blackwood mansion might not be as simple as she had hoped. There were secrets hidden in the shadows of this place, and she was now part of them whether she wanted to be or not. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elena heard the household beginning to stir. Soon she would have to face her new family and begin learning how to navigate their world. She dressed carefully in a simple blue dress that felt more like herself than the elaborate wedding gown had, and prepared to begin her first full day as Mrs. Alexander Blackwood. But first she hid the mysterious rose in the bottom drawer of her dresser wrapped in tissue paper. It felt important somehow, like a clue in a puzzle she didn't yet understand how to solve. Elena had always been good at solving puzzles, a skill that had helped her manage the complex scheduling and inventory at her family's bakery. Now she suspected those skills would be put to a much more dangerous test. 3 weeks into her marriage, Elena had settled into a strange routine at the Blackwood mansion. She woke each morning to find breakfast prepared by Maria, the only servant who seemed genuinely kind to her. The rest of the staff treated her with polite distance as if she were a temporary guest rather than the lady of the house. Alexander maintained his cold politeness, speaking to her only when necessary and spending most of his time locked away in his study or absent from the house entirely on mysterious business trips. Elena had tried to make conversation during their few shared meals, but he responded with monosyllables and barely looked at her. The isolation was getting to her. Elena missed the warmth and bustle of her family's bakery, missed the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful and delicious with her own hands. The mansion felt like a beautiful prison, all marble and silk and suffocating silence. One afternoon, while exploring the vast library, Elena discovered a section of books that seemed much older than the rest. The leather bindings were cracked with age, and the titles were written in languages she couldn't identify. As she reached for one particularly intriguing volume, a voice behind her made her jump. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." Elena spun around to find a tall, elegant woman watching her with amber eyes. The stranger had platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon and wore a black dress that probably cost more than Elena's family made in a month. There was something familiar about her face, though Elena was sure they had never met. "I'm sorry," Elena said, stepping away from the bookshelf. "I didn't realize this section was off limits." The woman smiled, revealing teeth that seemed unusually white and sharp. "Most things in this house are off limits to outsiders, my dear. Though I suppose you're not exactly an outsider anymore, are you?" She extended a pale hand. "I'm Victoria Blackwood, Alexander's aunt. I was away during the wedding festivities." Elena shook the offered hand, surprised by how cold Victoria's skin felt. "It's nice to meet you. I'm Elena." "Oh, I know exactly who you are." Victoria said, her smile never wavering. The little baker's daughter who caught our Alexander's eye. How romantic. There was something mocking in Victoria's tone that made Elena uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly romantic, Elena admitted. Our families arranged the marriage. How refreshingly honest, Victoria laughed, and the sound was like crystal breaking. Most people try to pretend their marriages in our circle are love matches, but you and I both know that love has very little to do with survival, don't we? Elena wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she remained silent. Victoria walked closer, studying Elena's face with unsettling intensity. You're prettier than I expected, Victoria mused. Alexander usually has such particular tastes, but then again, perhaps that's exactly why you were chosen. Chosen for what? Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Before Victoria could respond, Alexander appeared in the doorway of the library. His face darkened when he saw his aunt, and Elena noticed how quickly he moved to position himself between them. Victoria, he said, his voice carrying a warning. I didn't know you had returned. Just arrived this morning, darling, Victoria replied smoothly. I was getting acquainted with your lovely bride. She's quite curious about our family history. Elena was just leaving, Alexander said firmly, taking Elena's arm. Weren't you, Elena? Elena wanted to protest that she was perfectly capable of ending her own conversations, but something in Alexander's tone made her nod. Of course. It was nice meeting you, Victoria. As Alexander guided her out of the library, Elena heard Victoria's laughter following them down the hallway. Once they were out of earshot, Alexander released her arm and turned to face her. Stay away from Victoria, he said bluntly. She's dangerous. Dangerous how? Elena asked. She seemed a little odd, but trust me on this, Alexander interrupted. There are members of my family who don't approve of our marriage, and Victoria is one of them. She would hurt you just to get back at me. Elena studied Alexander's face, noting the genuine concern in his dark eyes. It was the first time since their wedding that he had shown any emotion when speaking to her. Why would she want to get back at you? Elena asked. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elena was beginning to recognize as a sign of his frustration. It's complicated. Family politics that go back generations. Just promise me you'll avoid her. I promise, Elena said, though she had a dozen more questions. But Alexander, I need to understand what I've gotten myself into. I can handle the truth, whatever it is. For a moment, Alexander looked like he might actually tell her something real. His guard dropped just enough for Elena to see the weight he carried, the burden that made his shoulders tense and his jaw tight. But then the walls went back up, and he became the cold stranger she had married. The truth is that you're safer not knowing, he said quietly. Trust me on that too. That evening, Elena decided to explore the mansion's gardens. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of jasmine, and for the first time since her wedding, she felt like she could breathe freely. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that made the landscape look magical. She wandered along winding paths lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. In the distance, she could hear the sound of water, and she followed it to discover a beautiful fountain in the center of a rose garden. The roses were unlike any she had ever seen, deep red blooms that looked almost black in the moonlight. Elena sat on the edge of the fountain, trailing her fingers in the cool water. She thought about her family, wondering how her mother was recovering and whether Sophia was adjusting to her new private school. The sacrifice Elena had made was worth it if it meant her family was safe and cared for, but the loneliness was harder to bear than she had expected. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Alexander was walking toward her, his white shirt almost glowing in the moonlight. He moved with that strange, fluid grace she had noticed before, making no sound despite the gravel path. You shouldn't be out here alone at night, he said when he reached the fountain. Why not? Elena asked. Are you worried about Victoria? Among other things. Alexander sat down beside her on the fountain's edge, maintaining careful distance between them. This area isn't entirely safe after dark. What kind of danger could there be on your own property? Elena asked. Wild animals? Alexander was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena, what do you know about my family's business?" "Real estate and investments, mostly," Elena replied. "Your father owns several companies?" "That's the public face of it," Alexander said, "but our real business is much older, much more complicated." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Alexander turned to look at her directly, and in the moonlight his eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. "My family has been in the protection business for over 3 centuries. We protect certain kinds of people from certain kinds of threats." "I don't understand," Elena said, though a chill was running down her spine. "Some families have secrets that could get them killed if the wrong people found out," Alexander continued. "We provide them with security, safe houses, new identities when necessary. In return, they pay us very well and owe us significant favors." "That sounds like," Elena struggled to find the right words. "Like organized crime?" Alexander finished. "In some ways it is, but we follow our own code of ethics. We protect the innocent and punish those who prey on the helpless." Elena processed this information, trying to reconcile it with what she knew about the Blackwood family's wealth and influence. "Is that why you needed to marry me? For some kind of business alliance?" Alexander shook his head. "Your father's bakery has nothing to do with our business. You were chosen for an entirely different reason." "Which is—" Alexander stood up abruptly and began pacing around the fountain. "Elena, there are things about the world that most people don't know about, things that go bump in the night, as they say. My family's business involves dealing with those things." Elena's mouth went dry. "What kinds of things?" "The kind that drink blood," Alexander said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Elena felt the world tilt around her as puzzle pieces began clicking into place. The pale skin, the aversion to sunlight, the unnatural grace, the sharp teeth she thought she had imagined. "Vampires," she whispered. Alexander nodded grimly. "My family has been hunting vampires for over 300 years. We're one of the oldest and most successful hunting families in the world." Elena stood up on shaky legs, backing away from Alexander. "And you married me because vampires have excellent senses," Alexander said, following her retreat. "They can smell hunter blood from miles away, but they can't detect ordinary humans as easily. A hunter who marries a human gains a level of protection, a way to blend into normal society." Elena's back hit the trunk of an oak tree and she stopped moving. "So I'm what, camouflage?" "Your protection," Alexander corrected. "For both of us." "As my wife, you're under the family's protection. No vampire would dare touch you without bringing down the wrath of every hunter in the country." "But I didn't know," Elena said, her voice rising. "I didn't consent to any of this. I thought I was just saving my family from bankruptcy." Alexander's expression softened with something that might have been regret. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But Elena, you're safer with us than you would be out there alone. Vampires are drawn to innocence, to goodness. You would have been a target eventually." Elena slid down the tree trunk until she was sitting on the ground, overwhelmed by everything Alexander had told her. "This is insane. Vampires aren't real." "They're just stories. I wish that were true," Alexander said, crouching down beside her. "But I've been hunting them since I was 16. I've seen what they're capable of, the lives they destroy." "Prove it," Elena said suddenly. "If vampires are real, prove it to me." Alexander hesitated. "Elena, you don't want to see—" "Yes, I do," Elena interrupted, standing up again. "If this is my life now, if I'm part of this world whether I want to be or not, then I need to see the truth." Alexander studied her face in the moonlight, searching for something. Whatever he found there seemed to convince him, because he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but not tonight. Tomorrow night I'll show you what we're really fighting against. But Elena, once you see it, there's no going back to ignorance. Are you sure you want that?" Elena thought about her comfortable old life, the simple pleasure of baking bread and serving customers who smiled and thanked her for beautiful cakes. That life was gone now anyway, sacrificed to save her family. She might as well understand what she had traded it for. "I'm sure," she said. Alexander reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. "You're braver than I gave you credit for." "I'm terrified," Elena admitted, "but I need to know." They walked back to the mansion in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. At Elena's bedroom door, Alexander paused. "Elena," he said quietly, "what I told you tonight about why we married, that's not the whole truth." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "There were other ways to gain the protection I needed," Alexander said, not meeting her eyes. "Other human women who would have served the same purpose? But I chose you." "Why?" Elena whispered. Alexander finally looked at her, and in his dark eyes, Elena saw something that made her breath catch. "Because from the moment I met you, I couldn't get you out of my head. Because you looked at me like I was a person instead of a weapon. Because you deserved better than the life poverty was going to give you." Before Elena could respond, Alexander turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway with her heart racing and her mind reeling. She went into her room and locked the door, then sat on her bed trying to process everything she had learned. Elena was married to a vampire hunter. She was living in a house full of people who fought monsters in the shadows. And tomorrow night she was going to see proof that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But underneath the fear and confusion, Elena felt something else, a strange sense of purpose. Her whole life she had felt ordinary, unremarkable. She had envied people who seemed to have grand adventures and important destinies. Now apparently she had stumbled into exactly that kind of life. As Elena prepared for bed, she thought about Alexander's final confession. He had chosen her not just as a convenient cover story, but because he genuinely cared about her. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. Elena fell asleep that night with her hand resting on the hidden rose she had found on her nightstand 3 weeks ago. In her dreams, she walked through dark forests alongside a man with glowing eyes, hunting creatures that should not exist. And for the first time since her wedding, the dreams didn't feel like nightmares. They felt like a glimpse of who she was meant to become. 2 months had passed since Alexander revealed the truth about his family's work, and Elena's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What started as reluctant acceptance had evolved into genuine fascination with the hidden world of supernatural threats and those who fought against them. Alexander had kept his promise to show her proof of vampires' existence. That night he had taken her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where a young vampire named Marcus had been terrorizing homeless people. Elena had watched from a safe distance as Alexander and his cousin James worked together to corner the creature. Seeing Marcus transform from a seemingly normal young man into something with glowing red eyes and fangs had been both terrifying and oddly liberating. All the strange things Elena had noticed about the Blackwood family finally made sense. The late-night meetings, the weapons hidden throughout the mansion, the way they moved with predatory grace they had learned from studying their enemies. Elena had expected to be traumatized by witnessing violence, but instead she found herself asking questions. How old was Marcus? How had he been turned? What drove vampires to kill when they could theoretically survive on animal blood or willing donors? Alexander had been surprised by her curiosity rather than revulsion, and gradually he began including her in more aspects of the family business. Elena learned that not all vampires were monsters, that some tried to live peacefully among humans. The Blackwood family focused their efforts on hunting the ones who couldn't or wouldn't control their predatory nature. Elena discovered she had a talent for research and pattern recognition that proved invaluable in tracking supernatural threats. Her background in managing complex schedules and inventory at the bakery translated well to organizing case files and identifying connections between seemingly unrelated incidents. More importantly, she and Alexander had begun developing a real partnership. The cold politeness of their early marriage had given way to late-night conversations about cases, shared meals where they actually talked to each other, and moments of genuine warmth that made Elena's heart race. But not everyone in the Blackwood family was pleased with Elena's integration into their world. Victoria had made her disapproval clear through a series of small cruelties. She would make cutting remarks about Elena's humble background during family dinners, question her contributions to cases, and find ways to undermine Elena's confidence whenever possible. Alexander tried to shield Elena from the worst of it, but Victoria was clever and careful never to cross lines when he was watching. The situation came to a head on a cold February evening when Elena was alone in the mansion's library, working on organizing files from a case in Boston. She had become absorbed in tracking the movement patterns of a particularly elusive vampire when she realized someone was watching her. Victoria stood in the doorway wearing a blood-red evening gown that made her pale skin look almost translucent. Her amber eyes were fixed on Elena with an expression of cold calculation. "Still playing at being one of us, I see," Victoria said, gliding into the room with unnatural grace. Elena looked up from her work, keeping her voice steady. "I'm doing my job, just like everyone else in this family." "Your job," Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Sweet Elena, you have no idea what your real purpose is, do you?" Something in Victoria's tone made Elena's blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Victoria perched on the edge of the desk, deliberately scattering some of Elena's carefully organized papers. "Did Alexander tell you why hunter families intermarry with humans? The real reason?" Elena's mouth went dry. "For protection. Camouflage. That's part of it," Victoria agreed, examining her perfect manicured nails. "But there's another reason. One that dear Alexander conveniently forgot to mention." Elena set down her pen and gave Victoria her full attention, dreading what was coming next. "Hunter families have been interbreeding for centuries. It's made us stronger, faster, better at what we do, but it's also made us unstable. The bloodline is becoming too concentrated, too pure. We need fresh genetic material to keep from descending into madness." "I don't understand," Elena said, though she was beginning to fear that she did. "Your breeding stock, darling," Victoria said with casual cruelty. "A way to introduce new blood into the family line. Your children will carry hunter abilities, but they'll be more stable, more balanced. That's why Alexander was instructed to marry a human woman of good character and health." Elena felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "Instructed?" "Oh, yes," Victoria smiled, clearly enjoying Elena's distress. "This whole marriage was arranged by the Council of Hunters. Your romantic husband had nothing to do with choosing you. You were selected from a list of suitable candidates." The room seemed to spin around Elena. Everything Alexander had told her about choosing her, about not being able to get her out of his head, had been a lie. She was nothing more than a broodmare selected for her genetic compatibility. "I can see you're upset," Victoria observed with false sympathy. "But really, you should be honored. Not every ordinary girl gets to contribute to something greater than herself." "Get out," Elena said quietly. "I beg your pardon." "Get out," Elena shouted, standing up so quickly that her chair fell backward. "Get out before I do something we'll both regret." Victoria's eyes flashed with genuine surprise at Elena's vehemence. For a moment, her mask of cold superiority slipped, and Elena glimpsed something almost like respect in her expression. "Well," Victoria said, straightening her dress, "perhaps there's more fire in you than I thought." "That's good. Our bloodline could use some passion." After Victoria left, Elena collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking with rage and hurt. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, about Alexander's feelings for her, had been built on lies. She had been so grateful for the small signs of genuine affection he had shown, so hopeful that their partnership was becoming something real. Elena spent the next hour staring at the case files spread across the desk, seeing them with new eyes. Had Alexander involved her in the family business because he valued her contributions, or because he was trying to keep her happy until she fulfilled her biological purpose? How much of their growing closeness was real, and how much was manipulation designed to make her a willing participant in the council's breeding program? When Alexander returned home near midnight, Elena was waiting for him in the entrance hall. He took one look at her face and immediately went on high alert. "What happened?" he asked, scanning the area for threats. "Victoria paid me a visit," Elena said, proud that her voice remained steady. "She told me some very interesting things about why the council chose me as your wife." Alexander's face went pale, and Elena knew with sinking certainty that Victoria had been telling the truth. "Elena," I can explain, can you? Elena interrupted. Can you explain how everything you told me about choosing me was a lie? How I'm just genetic material selected by committee? Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elena had once found endearing but now saw as a calculated display of vulnerability. It's not that simple. Then make it simple, Elena demanded. Tell me the truth, all of it, right now. Alexander looked around the entrance hall, noting the open doors and multiple exits. Not here. Too many people could overhear so. He led Elena to his private study, a room she had never been invited into before. It was lined with weapons and ancient books, and the desk was covered with maps marked with red pins. This was where Alexander planned his hunts, where he made life-and-death decisions about supernatural threats. Sit down, Alexander said, gesturing to a leather chair in front of the fireplace. I'll stand, Elena replied coldly. Alexander nodded, accepting her rejection of comfort. Victoria was right about the council's involvement. They did select you from a list of candidates. They've been monitoring potential genetic matches for all the young hunters in major families. Elena felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. How long? How long what? How long were they watching me before approaching my family? How long was I under surveillance?
Alexander's hesitation told Elena everything she needed to know.
2 years, he admitted quietly. 2 years, Elena repeated numbly. They watched me for 2 years, studying me like a lab rat. Elena, it's not like that, isn't it? Elena's composure finally cracked and 2 months of suppressed anger and hurt poured out. They watched me struggle to pay my mother's medical bills. They watched my family slowly sink into poverty. They could have helped at any time, but they waited until we were desperate enough to agree to anything. The council doesn't interfere unless they can get something out of it, Elena finished, unless they can manipulate people into giving them what they want. Alexander took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. Elena, please. Yes, the council arranged our marriage. Yes, they have expectations about children. But everything I told you about my feelings was true. I did choose you. From a pre-approved list, Elena said bitterly. From 3 women the council considered suitable, Alexander corrected. I met all of them. I could have married any of them. But I chose you because you were the only one who looked at me like I was a person instead of a title. Elena wanted desperately to believe him, but Victoria's words had poisoned every interaction they'd shared. How can I trust anything you say? You've been lying to me from the beginning. I've been protecting you, Alexander exploded, his careful control finally snapping. Do you have any idea what would have happened if I'd told you the complete truth from the start? You would have run, and the council would have found ways to force your compliance. They would have destroyed your family's business had your father arrested on fabricated charges, done whatever it took to make you desperate enough to agree. So you chose to lie instead. I chose to give you time to adjust, to see that this life could be good for both of us. I chose to let you make the decision to stay when you were ready instead of when you were cornered. Elena stared at Alexander, searching his face for any sign of deception. The man before her looked genuinely tortured by the conversation, his usual composure completely shattered. But she had thought she could read him before, and she had been wrong. What happens if I leave? Ayla asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Alexander's face went through several emotions before settling on resignation. The marriage contract your father signed has a 5-year minimum term, Alexander said quietly. If you try to leave before then, your family forfeits all financial support and becomes responsible for repaying every penny we've spent on your mother's treatment and Sophia's education. And after 5 years? After 5 years, you're free to go. The council will provide you with a generous settlement and help you establish a new identity if you want to disappear completely. Elena felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Unless I'm pregnant with the next generation of hunters. Then I imagine the terms change considerably. Alexander's silence was answer enough. Elena walked to the window and looked out at the gardens where she had learned the truth about vampires, where she had begun to fall in love with the man she thought Alexander was. Everything looked the same in the moonlight, but she felt like she was seeing it for the first time. "I need some air," she said finally. "Elena, it's not safe." "I don't care," Elena said, turning back to face him. "I need to think, and I can't do that in here." Alexander nodded reluctantly. "Take this," he said, pulling a silver pendant from his desk drawer. "It will mask your scent from vampires." Elena took the pendant without looking at it. How thoughtful, protecting the council's investment. The hurt that flashed across Alexander's face was either genuine or the best acting Elena had ever seen. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. Elena walked through the gardens for hours, replaying every conversation she'd had with Alexander, looking for signs of manipulation she had missed. The worst part was that she couldn't deny her feelings for him had been real. Even knowing about the lies and the council's agenda, she still felt drawn to the man who had shown her a world of purpose and danger. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that she had been manipulated from the very beginning. Her choices had been illusions, carefully constructed to lead her exactly where the council wanted her to go. As dawn approached, Elena found herself back at the fountain where Alexander had first told her about vampires. She sat on the edge and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, remembering a time when her biggest worry was whether they had enough flour for the morning rush at the bakery. She could leave, Elena realized. It would destroy her family financially, but there were other ways to make money. She could find work, take out loans, rebuild their life slowly but honestly. The question was whether she wanted to go back to that simple existence now that she had seen what else was possible. Elena thought about the vampire they had stopped last week, a creature that had been targeting college students. She thought about the research she had done that helped identify his hunting pattern. She thought about the young woman whose life they had saved because Elena had noticed a connection other hunters had missed. These people, manipulative agenda aside, were protecting innocent lives from monsters most people didn't even know existed. Elena had found a purpose here that her old life had never provided. But she had also found something else: self-respect. Elena had spent her whole life putting other people's needs before her own, sacrificing her dreams for her family's survival. She wouldn't do the same thing for the Council of Hunters. When Elena returned to the mansion, she found Alexander waiting for her in the entrance hall. He looked like he hadn't slept, his clothes wrinkled and his hair disheveled. Their eyes met across the marble floor, and Elena saw her own uncertainty reflected in his gaze. "I've made a decision," Elena announced. Alexander straightened, bracing himself for whatever was coming. "I'm staying," Elena continued, "but not on the council's terms. From now on, I'm a full partner in this marriage and in this work. No more lies, no more protection by omission. If you want me here, you treat me like an equal." "Elena, I'm not finished." Elena cut him off. "I also want to meet this council that's been pulling my strings. I want to see their faces when I tell them exactly what I think of their breeding program." A slow smile spread across Alexander's face, the first genuine expression of joy Elena had seen from him since their wedding day. "They're not going to like that," he warned. "Good," Elena replied. "I'm not particularly concerned with what they like." Alexander walked across the entrance hall until he was standing directly in front of Elena. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I love you. Not the council's carefully selected genetic match, not the solution to our bloodline problems, but you." Elena Martinez, who yells at vampires and organizes case files like works of art and looks at the world like it's full of possibilities instead of threats. Elena looked into Alexander's dark eyes and saw something she chose to believe was truth. "For what it's worth," she replied, "I love you too. Even though you're an arrogant, secretive, overprotective hunter who thinks he knows what's best for everyone." "Even though I lied to you?" "Even though you lied to me," Elena confirmed. "But Alexander, if you ever lie to me again about anything, I will leave and I will make sure the council knows exactly why their perfect plan fell apart." "Deal," Alexander said, and then he kissed her. It was their first real kiss, born of choice rather than duty, honesty rather than manipulation. Elena felt something settle into place inside her chest. a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with buildings or bloodlines. When they broke apart, Elena smiled up at her husband. "So when do I meet this council?" "They're actually coming here next week," Alexander admitted. "They want to check on our progress." Elena's smile turned sharp and dangerous. "Perfect. I'll bake them cookies." Alexander laughed, a sound of pure delight. God help them all. As Elena walked upstairs to finally get some sleep, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that awful wedding day 4 months ago. She had been a scared, sacrificial bride then, chosen for her genetics and her family's desperation. Now she was a hunter's wife by choice, a partner in work that mattered, and a woman who had learned to fight for herself. The council might have started this game, but Elena intended to change the rules. She was no longer the rejected bride whispering about departure in the morning. She was Elena Blackwood, and she was exactly where she belonged,